right, I'd like to call to order the policy meeting, March 29th. I see all our members are here. So all our members, Dan Dayvetcher, Daniel Bretson, and myself. I need approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
First item is advertising in the schools. Turn it right over to Ryan.
Thank you. I think there's a couple of things that we had for advertising in the schools. We first of all had clarity at the last meeting just on a few kind of pieces administratively that we wanted some feedback on, which I think was helpful. But the other part was really looking at just a few changes or a few additions to kind of fall in line with either with classes and particularly pieces that are moving forward. So Steve and I had a chance to kind of talk about this policy, and one of the things that we've added is school media productions may accept paid advertising under established procedures, and that's a piece that we are meeting with our staff here in a couple of weeks with regards, and then that's going to find its way back through the curriculum committee. Also, it talks about the high school academic courses may involve students in the process of seeking paid advertising as part of the course curriculum. These courses require prior board approval. I actually think the board approval probably fits for both of those. But what we think about right now that's really not included in there, and Steve reminded me of this as part of our conversation, is we do have classes that do sell advertising. Yearbook does it every year. And that's a class. It's also kind of a co-curricular piece, but there's advertising as part of that. So I thought just making sure that we include that as part of our policy makes sense. And then the second part here is really that media production class, which is an approved class that has a piece that would work with our marketing department to really kind of forward some of their advertising experiences. The piece we're meeting with our staff on here, I believe it's in the first or second week of April, is really trying to vet out what that process looks like. It's certainly not something we want where students are just on their own kind of gathering advertising. That's going to be on things like our scoreboard or our media pages out there that are like where our live streams are. But it's a piece that we have to have some control over and some work kind of hand in hand with the students administratively, particularly in the business office with our teachers and then with our students as that part goes forward. So that's a piece that's going to be that's where the under established procedures are. And I also wanted the piece that as we do these things, that they should be pieces that the board is aware of and that they've approved as we go forward. So I think what we will do is probably at the curriculum committee meeting coming is kind of revisiting like that multimedia class, the marketing class, and through that share kind of what their ideas are so that we can then bring those forward to the full board. So you know kind of how they're going to be operating and then what our procedures would be as far as administratively us working with the students and the teacher to make sure that any pieces are done in a way that's in accordance with our policies, procedures, and the sound business practices. So what we're looking for is just wanting to add these two pieces in there, and then the procedural pieces will be forthcoming, but the whole piece of board approval is that you really can't move forward with these things until you have the approval of the board.
And what process do the established procedures?
And that's the piece that's the part that's going to be, that'll be clarified as we move forward.
Right, and they're clarified. Then does it filter its way into the procedure? Is it a supplement? Is it like, how does that?
Oh, good question. It could solely be, it could be two things. It could be something that we kind of tie into the policy in the future. It could also be a piece that's just an administrative, I would probably recommend it just be an administrative rule or administrative guideline, because there's going to be some pieces here I'm sure we're going to have to tweak and kind of develop as we move forward. But that'll be a piece that we would bring as we brought this forward. We would, just as you think about like when we've had co-curricular groups come forward that are raising funds and they have approval of the board for kind of their process, we would treat this in a very similar manner. So that as they're coming forward with kind of ideas for how they would structure this, what types of things that they would be proposing, and then really some of the pieces that we're looking at are kind of the paperwork behind it. We bring that forward as part of the procedural piece and be able to share that with the board. And then at that time, we'd be able to act on it.
So are we looking to?
This is just the policy side of it. And
Yeah.
then, as Ted pointed out, there's the procedural piece that will come when those items come before the board.
So we don't need to approve this one yet, or we
I would ask, because this is a change, this is actually a change
adding
to
7 and 8?
policy.
Yeah,
This policy then allows for those things to happen. And then it's very similar to like where you have like in other pieces, like at the bottom it says about other situations approved by the superintendent of the board. Right now, that's where a lot of the things with like co-curriculars come forward. And then as part of that, they're bringing forward, well, what do you find acceptable? So when we looked at like the soccer piece that came forward just a few years ago, there were things that could go on the fence, there were things that could go on the scoreboard, et cetera. Kind of where could advertising be and how could that be structured? Those are all pieces the board had a say in. So when we start to look at things that involve our academic courses that start to experience into this realm, I would anticipate that's coming forward in a very similar way. This is just allowing for that to occur, and it's articulating that there will be procedures developed and that those pieces will come in front of you.
So you want a recommendation to the board?
Yeah, I'd like to move this to the full board for the purpose of
Motion to recommend approval to the full board.
second.
All in favor?
Aye.
This will come, this specific piece that what precipitated this will go to the curriculum committee, and you'll see that. I think we were talking about probably in April and May. And that'll find its way to the full board. So the full board is kind of aware of kind of what parameters you're putting in place around that, and what some of those procedures are.
All right. Next topic, school property disposal, policy 690. Again, Randy.
Yep, this is that's the kind of what Steve took a look at here was the differences that we have kind of adopting a new policy that's kind of updated that we looked at the last time. This was a sample policy out of the School Board Association, and the pieces that we felt were necessary or fit most closely in with our current practices and some of the pieces. You want to talk through kind of what any specific pieces that you felt were important here? This is really a rewrite of our policy.
Yeah, just as a reminder, we shared a draft of what the School Board Association put together at the last meeting of this committee. If you remember, that draft had the school building administrators also responsible for property disposal. And we talked about how our preference was to coordinate that centrally to make sure that we use property across different facilities. So we removed that component of the draft from the WSB, so it is still managed through central office. The only thing just to note is there's a couple dollar amounts in here. One of them I put in $25 where it referenced as far as what is the value on a per item basis when we will not consider something minimal. Could suggest that should be lower, maybe higher. And then the 5,000 is a figure that was referenced in prior policy. So that's really not a change, but this has a statement in there. Any per item estimated resale value in excess of $25 shall not be considered minimal, meaning we would make an attempt to sell the items. So if we had, a series of old iPads that are worth 30 each, we would try to sell them. If we had a series of old iPads that were worth $2 a piece, we probably wouldn't. So I put that dollar amount in there. You may think that it's too low. You may think it's too high. I just put that in there to start the discussion. The 5,000 references the figure that we had before. If you think that's too low, you certainly could make a suggestion for a different dollar amount. But those are the only two things I think that you might want to weigh in on.
I think our whole goal of bringing this forward was just trying to kind of bring forth to the board kind of a realization that we do have items that we do discard every year, wanting to kind of revisit the whole piece about resale. There are some items that we certainly, particularly the tech side, that right now our option is to sell them, or we also have a recycle program. So that's the piece that I think when we start to look at, as Steve used an example of like iPads, Chromebooks, etc. Some of them may have a value of 25 or more, and that kind of just precipitates us kind of putting forth that effort to provide the sale. So I think this is an area that just needed some refreshing and some fresh eyes on it. And this is really a revised policy that I think doesn't differ greatly from what we have, but I think it just puts some a few different updated language to kind of what that process looks like.
So are we looking at this one?
So you're looking at the one in your right hand.
This one,
That one.
and this is,
That's the current.
okay, so we're looking at this.
Yeah, you're looking at the one that has the top, it says sample policy
Yeah,
right now.
yeah.
That's really us adopting and really modifying a bit what the recommended policy was out of the School Board Association, so piece. That's part of our review, but this was one that was really, the reason it's coming forward is just one I wanted to have conversations on as I kind of watched how we dispose of items over time and thought it was worthy of bringing it to the board's attention. And in the process of doing that, realized that there was kind of an updated policy that we could bring forward. So,
Well, I think the numbers are fine.
When we
So,
go to like a Wisconsin surplus, and you want to get rid of stuff, you contact them and they just deal with it from there. Is that
how does that
generally
work?
works?
So they sell everything through a public auction. So they advertise on like Madison area television stations in different locations. And they just run public sales. They don't just have they'll have our stuff in Middleton's and they run it all as a sale. And then sell it all out there for the public. And then the one downside from that is like people can buy things for like $1 that are really worth more than that because nobody else was bidding on it. This does give us more power. This gives us a little bit more flexibility to like hold a community-wide garage sale out here and sell iPads to residents for $50. It's probably a better approach. Most of the people who buy a lot of this stuff on Wisconsin, the auction site, resell it on eBay or Amazon because they can make money from doing that. So I think this would give us a little bit more flexibility to maybe do some of our own stuff as well out here once we determine the dollar amount. But basically, it's just a public sale format through auction, so things can go way too cheap.
So are we gonna join the Waunakee garage sale?
We could do that.
We could be a large competitor for
We
everything.
certainly could be. Yeah, we have a lot of stuff to sell.
I just think it gives us a little bit more flexibility. I like how it's written.
And it's not worth anything. I'm not just thinking about it as we have a website to explore doing it on your own. Takes too much resources to go and do that. If you have that much stuff or have a class of some sort associated with.
Yeah, you can do some of those things. We could do it with a club of some sort. I mean, like Pay It Forward does a garage sale every year as part of their piece. We could share revenue with a group like that. And I think it gives us some options of what we do. But I look at some of the tech areas that in many cases that we've tried to sell, but like the Chromebook market's saturated right now. So trying to put them out there on the public auction site, it does exactly what Steve does. They go for $1 a piece or that, and they get resold on eBay. So I'd rather put it out to our community. So we could certainly do some of those things. So it could be that's at least what was in my head when I was thinking about this, is wanting to at least be able to provide something.
Motion to recommend approval.
second,
All in favor?
aye.
Aye. Next item, discuss, consider guidelines for elected officials in schools and related events.
Yeah, so this was just really a piece as I shared at the last meeting. It has a number of different pieces. One, some guidelines for our staffs and things that I think just give us some ideas as far as like what we allow in school and how some parameters to help us kind of guide our ways through that. I think the question that came up last time at the meeting was, well, how do you do you want it as a policy or do you want it as an administrative guideline? If it's a guideline, really, how do you kind of get those pieces out there? I mean, certainly we have guidelines on several different things within the district. One of the ways, I just wanted to show this to you, beginning of every school year, all of our staff have to sign off on this. So this is really a required in-service materials, and it has everything in there from our obligations as mandatory reporters under abuse and neglect, acceptable use. It has some of the things that are required for us to provide information on every year. But this is a place that we can also insert items like this that we want everybody to be aware of so that they kind of at least know what the parameters are. Many of these things aren't necessarily instructional that are here, but it's certainly a place where we can add whatever we want into it. It's obviously a thing that we have to have people kind of read through, and then they sign off that they're familiar with what those really guidelines are around these very specific things. The other places that if it's a guideline, then it can go is into like our staff handbooks and such that you approve every year. And the third option is that we can move it forward as an actual board policy. And that's something then obviously falls into kind of a policy book and has the rules around it from a policy perspective. So that's kind of if you kind of like what you see here, then obviously I think we didn't have a lot of feedback on the content of it last time. It was more on would it be a policy or a guideline, and then if it was a guideline, how do you kind of push it forward and make sure people are aware of it? Those are kind of the ways that we would do it.
And I failed to mention about public comments. We did a public comment on speaking about this and regarding the just pointing out some of the bullet points, one of them being approval by the building administrator. Just as put that all to one individual. So just wanted to bring that up.
I like it as a guideline as opposed to policy. I think guidelines are more flexible. And and if we put it in this or in the handbooks, I don't think it makes a difference. I think where you think it would be appropriate.
I mean, as Kim Shaw and I spent a little bit of time talking about it, we're fine with it being a guideline for now. And we can kind of see just kind of how those pieces go. I think the public comment was with regard to approval by building administrator. Really, my first reason for putting that in there is I just want our building administrator to be informed. So that they should be informed of what's going on, so that they can help guide it if there is anything that needs to be guided. Whether that's a change approval to inform, it doesn't really necessarily matter to me, because if they're informed and they find something that doesn't fit within what we should be doing, they obviously have an obligation to address that. But doesn't, if that's kind of the public comment piece that was a concern in the second paragraph, really my intent of writing it that way is so that the person that our administration is informed of what's going on, so that they can guide it.
I'm happy with leaving it in as approval.
I am as well. That's how I understood it to be as well.
So in which case, really, the board doesn't need to take any action.
I don't think it was really more just to bring this to your attention. If we're going to keep it as a guideline, that's where it is. And then you'll see it as it comes through probably some other channels as we start to approve. Everybody comfortable with it as a guideline, and then we'll bring it forward in some of the other documents.
Sure.
As a guideline, where does it get kind of published? Is it in like a handbook then?
Yeah, there's a couple options. We can put it in the handbook, or we can put it into this document, which is like 80 pages long. This is one that has all the different stuff in it of what teachers have to sign off on this every single year, that you've reviewed it, you know kind of where those pieces are. So I'd probably put it in multiple places, to be honest, so that people are aware of it. So but we can articulate that as a concern. So no action on that. We'll just put it into our handbooks and our guidelines and make sure that's right.
All right. Next issue, transportation in areas of unusual hazard.
So this is one we looked at the last meeting as well. And what we were requesting is that we actually create a policy on it. So we took a look at, we received your feedback last time, and Steve kind of worked through this from his lens as far as kind of being responsible for the transportation areas. So Steve, I'll let you kind of walk through a little bit of some of the choices you made based on the feedback that we have.
Thank you, Randy. So again, we shared some examples with you last month, and we requested going with the shorter version of the policy. If you can remember from last month, the draft from the WSB was was longer. There was more information that went into like administrative procedures. And it was a lengthy document, and we requested just keeping it more policy related. And so where I ended it was where the WASB draft went into more administrative procedures. So this was more at a policy level. And then the bullet points, Rebecca, if you could just go back up for a minute. The bullet points there at the bottom really reference the types of factors that would be considered in looking at an area being unusually hazardous. So I looked at those and looked at the ones that were applicable for our community and included those. There were a couple that I took out that weren't really applicable for us. But basically, it just sets a policy out that pretty much mirrors the process that the DPI follows and recommends for hazardous transportation. And like Randy mentioned last month, our intentions would be to not engage in a review of this topic for the fall, for the start of the new school year, but wait to see how the facility process plays itself out and whether or not that process would result in any potential boundary changes, which then impact transportation changes. You do want to do all of those things at the same time. This would just have a nice policy in place where when we get to that point, it really just outlines the policy from the perspective of what we would consider in our community for hazardous transportation. So while we would ask you to approve the policy and bring it forward to the next board meeting, please know there is no intent to do anything with it until the referendum process plays itself out and the board determines where we may or may not go for November, and then whatever the public decides to do.
We don't have a policy on this right now, and as we really reviewed this whole area, and this was actually a topical area we were going to be bringing forward to the board this year, just for discussion purposes, and particularly related to the referendum. And as we reviewed that, we felt we should have a policy that at least provides what those guidelines are that we have to follow from the DPI. Our recommendation to you is that we should adopt a policy, and this would be the one that we recommend.
Based on previous discussions, as I recall, we also have that regular review with the Waunakee Police about designating such areas. Wasn't there something that happened during the last referendum, not the last referendum, last school thing about them designating certain crossings as hazardous?
That's part of the process of reviewing it. It's not done on an annual basis. We haven't.
I know it's not annual, it's like every.
There's no set timeline. So I think the last time we did it was many years ago.
The last time we talked about this with the committee, because the topic came up from some parents wanting us to review the board's transportation policy specifically for ninth graders. And we talked about how the hazardous transportation areas in our community stop after 8th grade. That was determined by the Dane County Sheriff previous when they did the review. Parents were asking us to put it in place. Randy and I were commenting that many of the crosswalks in the community are very different today than when the Dane County Sheriff last looked at this. And in fact, it may be possible that some of the areas that currently are designated as hazardous may no longer be so. Because when you look at the factors on there, factors are the availability of crossing guards, factors are whether you have a clear pathway to get across the pedestrian crosswalk, and we have those now. So it is likely that once we do engage in this topic again, we probably will have fewer hazardous areas than we do today because the crosswalk situation is so improved. And as an example, on Highway Q, we have 3 crossing guards, all at locations that are very easy to cross with an adult with the button that you can push. It's just way better than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So it's possible that once we do jump into this, our transportation policies could change.
But we haven't done a full review of this in many years. Previous information it's done.
Some of it has been.
we've done it with some, as we've kind of grown in some very
Yeah.
specific areas, but a wholesale look at it, which is part of, I think, what we may be wanting to consider at some point in the future. This policy outlines what it is, and we felt that's important to have in place.
So I recommend we take this hazardous area and recommend it to the board.
Second,
I would say we want to just hold it here until, I mean, in case something were to change, there's no reason to put it at the board. We're not going to do anything with the board until.
I thought we needed a policy in order to get
You
things
don't
going.
need a policy to get it going. I just think it's a piece, right now, it's a hole in our policy. We
Oh.
don't have a policy of it. So I would just recommend we move it forward and put it into policy, and then at the point in time when you don't need a policy on it. I just think it's
Just
a
look
good
at
piece.
that.
It's a good piece from a communication standpoint to the community that this is kind of what the process looks like.
So we're putting it in policy?
That's what my recommendation would be, is that you recommend that, I would recommend this committee approve it to move to the board for consideration as a policy.
Okay,
And
that's
there's a
what I
motion and it's seconded, so we're all in favor?
Aye.
All right. Next issue, flag policy. So, as we, from the last meeting, we took this flag policy for discussion for the full board, if you recall.
Mhm.
And from that, I don't know that we totally had direction from that, but it was a good discussion.
Yeah,
So, with that,
I'm just wondering if maybe we'd be better off, since we're not obviously going, it didn't seem like there was a lot of support for going through the whole concept. What about just taking some of the simple guidelines of saying how big the flag can be, how it has to be, any comment would have to be, policy would have to come forward, or request would have to come forward, a simple statement on how you fly it, and just do that. And that way, if someone wants to make a motion for one or whatever, that is still kind of addressed on a case by case. We don't try to put an ironclad way to determine yes or no, but we can very specifically state how the flag, size of the flag, how it has to be flown and stuff like that, so that, you know, it's consistent in how we actually do fly any type of flag, whether we do or not. Instead of trying to set a policy that defines whether we fly a flag or not. Does that make sense?
some of it does. I mean, I like the idea of not having a hard policy on flag flying, but what I like is that the Board of Education has the sole discretion to determine if it will be flown. I like the idea that you have time ahead to think about it. And I like the idea that you have a clear message of what you're trying to convey, and the people that want it flown need to be able to convey that. And I like the idea that there's a reason for flying it on our website somewhere, that there's an explanation of why we're flying it. And I also like the idea that it doesn't have to be forever. I don't know if it's just the one time you bring it forward, or we set up a time that it's going to be flown every May, or just it's going to be flown this May. I'm not sure on that one. That's where I'm leaning anyway.
my leaning was to leave it after everything I've told you, commemorate flags, just from a policy standpoint, so someone goes along with what they're saying. And it sort of goes back to what I said. I'm still having a hard time figuring out the objective criteria for using one. We see later in this committee, in this meeting, we're going to be talking about, raising another one. And it just seems that we will be running into issues the more further we go on. We're going to have all these flags, that how did this one get approved? How did this one, or be those issues. So we the flag flying for this national and state flag and try to commemorate these issues in another way. That's not diminishing the issues at all. Why is the flagpole that is
So you don't want any commemorative flags on the poles?
not on poles?
Okay.
So that, and that's getting to the point of deciding yes or no to the actual flag itself versus a policy on how any flags will be flown, which I think it can be easily two separate issues. You know, if a flag comes up and the board decides no, well, that's fine. It's no different than saying we support or don't support a given field trip. Do we say absolutely no field trips? No, we say field trips have a general guideline for how you move them forward. Then the specific field trip comes up and we decide yes or no based on the merits of that field trip, as long as it follows the policy of how it got there. And that's how I'm kind of viewing the flag policy is you have a policy for how it gets there, and then the board decides whether it is worthy or not and votes it yes or no. And it seems to me that's two separate issues. And the fact we're trying to make the policy cover both issues is why we're not getting it. Does that make sense?
I think it's putting, there's those that view the flagpole as something that the commemorative flag shouldn't be on it, right? So why, then it makes it an issue, like you're supporting or not supporting that commemoration. And that's not really what it has to do with. And could it be done in a different way? Could you do it could you do it to what one of our members said last time? You develop something in the school that is more educational, that's going to be in the school and it's going to inform the student body. I'm not sure that's a good idea or not, but
I think the board has to decide if we fly a flag or not. The policy committee has to decide how we would fly a flag if it was commemorative.
I mean, I guess I kind of get your point that if we had no policy, it just wouldn't be allowed. You know, so that's kind of
Or it would.
killing the discussion before ever doing it.
Or they just put it,
Or
they put it up on their own.
it would be allowed with no rules.
What I would see right now is like, right now you don't have a policy.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's actually a policy that talks about like national anthem or something that talks about the flag early in there. But there's no policy on like flying the flag, the etiquette of it, what goes on with it. So that's absent. So what's happened at this point is the flag discussion has come through kind of separate motion or separate resolution to the board. And that's that's having a policy or not having a policy or having one that just stops after that doesn't preclude somebody else from bringing that forward if they want. It doesn't mean the board has to approve it, but it means that doesn't preclude that from being a discussion that can take place. The one piece I just want to kind of toss out there is, and it's more from like a policy standpoint and making a decision on a policy, whichever direction it goes, is also just wanting to be cognizant that there is a case in front of the Supreme Court. And that is it meritorious to think about waiting to see before you put any policy in place that kind of puts our direction there, that you wait to see what that outcome is. And then that may inform kind of at least what the kind of the rule of the land will be around kind of a commemorative flag piece. So you're not writing something that's kind of either that may fall not in line with that. So that's it doesn't preclude you from doing it or not doing it, because right now we don't have a policy at all. It just kind of delays it until you kind of see kind of what that looks like. That's just kind of, at least kind of how my mind is working at from a policy perspective. The decision on flags still is there because we've obviously had those conversations and made decisions on those in the absence of a policy.
Well, for a policy committee, then I'd say we wait. You know, make a policy.
I'm fine with that.
So.
Okay.
I think right now you can mean that I think communication with the board would just be don't adopt the policy right now. Let's kind of see
Till
what
Supreme
comes out
Court
of those
or
pieces.
court says
And
something.
then you can revisit that at a point in the future once you kind of have that.
And I know Rebecca is excellent that if you do come up with a new flag, she makes very sure that you follow the rules on how it has to be flown in appropriate sizing. She's very good about it.
Well, and I don't know if I'm out of order here, but does this mean that the suggestion that comes before to have a mental health awareness flag doesn't come to this committee?
Actually, the only reason I picked this one is because where else would it go?
Goes to the board.
Well, this is just there was a request by the board to have advance notice and some discussion ahead of time. So this was a way, the reason I asked it to be added here is one, we were talking about flag policy, but then two, this will then put it on everybody's radar. There'd be a discussion. People would see the resolution well before the board meeting. And that if there were basic questions, people would have time to ask them.
But I think if they're following what we're doing, they're hearing that's what's up there, but we
Right.
haven't entertained that we're having a position on that.
No,
No,
I don't think it matters if this committee per se takes
Yeah.
or doesn't take a position on whether it should be approved or not. I would notice though that I was trying to sort of follow what people were thinking a policy should be. So that's why I bring it here and that I put my name on it, but it actually came from the counselors and I believe one of our therapists at the school, one of our psychiatrists at the school. This was actually their idea, and they were hoping to use this as a way to bring awareness within the student body of getting help and working in this area, and that it's not something they should avoid. And that hopefully we can work some messaging around it about how they can get that help within the school district.
Is there any concern like with this particular topic, thinking of the other ones are kind of honoring or they're, you know, looking at that. In this one, these are individuals that are having some emotional, mental issues potentially. Is it a trigger in some way potentially? It's like, oh, that reminds me again that I'm having some issues. It's a legitimate question.
I guess when the discussion was done, it wasn't about triggering or that something like that could happen. It was more empowering to say there was nothing wrong with asking for help. And as you say, some of the other flags are about honoring or whatever, but they're also about saying that there are students facing difficulties because of the group they're in, and that we're trying to help them be more accepted, more empowered to feel a full part of everyone around them, not feel isolated, not feel ignored. And mental health has, been brought up quite a bit the last couple of years. And one of the biggest things on mental health, and I was really fortunate about a year ago, I was part of a VA training thing about suicide, mainly with veterans, but it was brought up by many of the therapists that one of the biggest things is this is very similar on all suicides. And one of the biggest things is suicide victims are often made to feel that they shouldn't talk about it. And that makes them even more isolated, makes them feel more separate and more alone. And often just even, I was really surprised. One of the first things they say when you're helping someone that you think might commit suicide is say, are you thinking of committing suicide? Allowing them to speak is the single biggest outlet. And ignoring them or not bringing it up actually makes it worse for them. And I was stunned by that, but that's what everyone said, and that's what their main focus was
So-
actually about having anyone acknowledge that there's an issue that they can get help with.
but then this would be the topic that you bring to the board when we're trying to decide if we want to do it.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah.
So not here.
So,
So you will bring this as an informational item to the board through this committee, not looking for an endorsement from this committee, but having it go to the board at the next meeting. Is that
Right.
what your intent was?
just an idea of the infamous 2-meeting rule and stuff like that.
Which we haven't adopted yet, but that's
Well,
okay.
yeah, I was trying to be helpful.
Okay,
So just kind of going back to the flag policy piece. So right now, we're just gonna kind of hold on that. We'll see kind of where things kind of fall out from the court's perspective. And then after that piece, that could be a piece that comes back here with kind of an update on that. And we can determine.
like it.
And so that. Okay, if they bring in the other ones to the board. We'll move on to update special education, transportation aid eligibility.
So this piece Dave brought to me, I think he had a question from a community member, because with regards to special education, transportation eligibility. So I asked Steve to kind of pull together what the actual guidelines on this, because there are specific pieces with regards to students who are eligible for busing, students who are not eligible for busing. And then really how that impacts a student with a disability and siblings who live in the same house. So I'll let Steve kind of talk a little bit about kind of what that whole piece looks like. But there is a document in your packet that will give you some more information.
Thank you, Randy. A couple of things to keep in mind with this topic. So the majority of students who are in special education have an IEP that does not include specialized transportation, which means a student has an IEP for some special education service, but they ride regular education buses, as they're called by the DPI. Specialized transportation or regular transportation. So most students who have an IEP ride regular transportation routes.
If they qualify.
If they qualify, yes, thank you. Some students have an IEP that includes specialized transportation. That then trumps any of our normal transportation policies. So an example of that would be a student lives across the street from Prairie Elementary School. So they're well within the 1 mile limit we have for students to be transported. And in their IEP, it says they receive door-to-door transportation. That's called specialized transportation. That is done based on a student's individual needs. So when that occurs, that has to be a separate bus that is not picking up students that are on regular education routes, and it goes to their home and to the school. In that case, let's say the example of being across the street from Prairie, no one else can get on that bus because no one else is eligible. Because if you're within 1 mile of Prairie Elementary School, no regular ed students can ride the bus. Not in that house, not their neighbor, not anyone else, because they're too close to school. But if a student has it in their IEP, they can get it. The non-disabled sibling cannot get on that bus. Now, it's a different story if they're in a transportation area. So let's just say, talk about Savannah Village and talk about the intermediate school. If they have a 5th grader and a 6th grader, they're both eligible for transportation. If one of the students has an IEP with specialized transportation, and it is the specialized bus route, the sibling can get on that bus because the sibling is eligible to ride a bus. But this can get really confusing because community members are thinking, based on where they live, I could live across the street from Prairie, I could be 0.9 miles from Prairie. Why can't my student who doesn't have an IEP jump on that bus? It's because they're not eligible, right? If they are eligible, it's a different situation. But you see the attachment showed that the DPI says under only very strict circumstances, can a student who doesn't have an IEP for specialized transportation get on that bus?
And it's an IEP for transportation, not just an IEP.
Correct.
It has to have that specification.
Exactly. Yep.
And I can personalize it. I mean, my daughter Kate has an IEP. So she has specialized transportation. Her program, her educational program starts when she gets on the bus. It's where you learn independence. It's where you learn how those pieces of how you operate kind of in that place. When one of my daughters was also at Prairie Elementary, that's their attendance area. This is the example. Kate was eligible, my other child wasn't. So she either walked or my wife took her or I took her to school. Those were two different pieces. Now, when you switch that over to where they're at the intermediate school, the high school, they're both eligible, they can get on that bus. So that's really the example. I think that's kind of just a personalized piece. The piece that I think we often get, it gets a little confusing and it's hard to try to understand is when you do have a student whose program requires them to be on it and you have one or two other siblings who now have a different set of rules. And the question that often comes up is, well, why can't they get on that bus because there's room, it's partially because that there's specific rules as far as the transportation pieces that we provide, in particular, that's tied to some of our funding, so.
So there's nothing for us to do other than to be aware of it.
Yeah, this was just an FYI.
Yeah,
This was
yeah.
just to kind of give you an
Somebody came
example. of-
So this happened, I want to say 4 years ago, somewhere in that range. I know it was before the last election. And the parent came in and brought it to the policy committee with the idea of asking us to look at that. And it was, the whole board overwhelmingly voted to approve it. And then we found out the rule was, no, you can't. And then we stopped. Now, it's been a number of years, things change. It doesn't hurt to see if the legislature changed any of it. And honestly, the only way this ever changes is honestly if the state changes the law on the reimbursement. I mean, there's specific, when you read through the whole document, there is specific ability to have another student be on the IEP, but the IEP has to require it. And there's specific ways that has to be met. You can't just say, oh, let's just write the IEP to include the sibling. It's like, no, you just now lost all the funding for that. And then that brings up all your special ed funding. You know, it hurts that whole transportation element. So we cannot just write IEPs to make that happen, which was the thought that could happen. It's like, now, could we go and could people start going to the state legislature and say, hey, you should allow this to happen? Feel free.
Along with getting more special ed.
Let's go down the whole school funding formula and have a great time. But it is not a desire of the school board to not make this happen. We would love to make it happen, I think, and I'm sure the vote would be the same as 4 years ago. But unfortunately, that's just.
Specialized transportation happens for many reasons. Some of it is kind of programmatic as far as like I shared earlier. It's the students' program starts when they get on that bus and they learn about that process of being more independent. We also have kids that are very medically fragile. We have kids in wheelchairs, and we provide those transportation. And those are the things that are specifically written into the program to help move forward with their education program. So that's where this fits, and then it just gets. That's where this comes up every single year. I think you answer these questions with parents on an annual basis, particularly when you have the siblings. So this is really just an FYI. Heard kind of the question you received and wanted to bring it back through here so everybody understood that.
Also, I remember we had someone asking because they saw a student being picked up across the street. Why can't they? That's probably the one you get almost every year. Well, the bus is picking up a kid across the street that's in my kid's class. Why can't my kid get on? This is why. And that's a hard thing to communicate sometimes. Thanks. And I'm sure we'll talk about this again in 2 or 3 more days.
That takes us to future meetings.
And I think we have kind of similar type of things. The one piece I'm going to add on here at a future meeting is just some things with regards to kind of clarifying social media use and staff, etc. It's kind of a growing piece right now. I'm just trying to get my head around that. I think we need to have some greater clarification. So that'll be a piece coming forward. Otherwise, the items are there as we've had before. Rebecca and I can kind of cut forth some time. We'll kind of be moving some of the pieces forward with the policy aspects. We have some of our administrators starting to look at the different series of policies, and then we'll work with the School Board Association and one of their attorneys to help us kind of streamline that policy, that process as much as possible. My ideal would be to move some more of the policy book forward before the end of the year, so that we can kind of move this process.
And you might add any expense reimbursements.
Sure,
Absolutely. If I could bring that one back to the next.
Expense reimbursement.
Gas prices.
Just jump.
Yep.
Absolutely. Otherwise, that's all we have to.
We'll need to set up another. We'll get doing that right now.
Probably. Let's hold until I know exactly kind of where we're at. So I'll remember back in that. We can set that up later. Okay. I'll take a motion.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.